Good morning. My name is Kathleen Stevens. I'm the president of KEI, the Korea Economic Institute of America, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Our panel is already sort of taking the stage here. Our first one, we're going to have a number. This is a joint collaboration between KEI and KIEP, the Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, based in the Republic of Korea. We're very pleased to have some representatives from KIEP here, including our great friend, Professor Kim Dong-jun, and thank you very much for coming and for all the support that we get from KIEP, not only now, but through the years. This is the first time, at least as far as I know, I haven't been here too long, that we've had quite this kind of, well, it's not just a seminar, what do we call this? Colloquium, conference, anyway, with a lot of papers that were commissioned. And I want to thank first and foremost, after KIEP, those who did take time, a lot of time, I know, out of their many other obligations to research and write these papers. The discussants who've come along and have read them, as I'm looking forward to reading them, and to have this conference and discussion today. So I'm looking forward to a very rich and full day. I think we have a great audience for this, and I mean this in terms of the quality I see here as well as the quantity. And I also think that these papers are going to be a real lasting contribution to a number of subjects about which, in a way, nowadays, there's no shortage of words said, but I think sometimes getting new insights is a little difficult. So I think we've tried to take and I know our scholars and others who've contributed have tried to take a very rigorous and fresh approach to some very challenging issues. So with that, I think the others I want to really thank are Troy Stangarone from KEI and his work, Yeon-ho Kim, who feels like he's on KEI staff. He's been our non-resident fellow and has done so much to put this together and to really contribute to our dialogue here. And of course, to everybody else at KEI, including our interns, which, like everyone else in Washington, we could not even open the doors without. So let's get the first panel up here. Welcome. Let's make this very collegial, informal in a sense, and have a really great conversation. There's no conventional wisdom here. We want to hear some fresh thoughts. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Ambassador Stevens, for those warm remarks and opening things up today. I think we have a really great panel here this morning, and I think you're going to learn a lot, and it's going to be a very interesting discussion. I'm going to take, because everyone should have the bios, and just very briefly introduce everyone, so that way we have the maximum amount of time for everyone to present, and then for the discussants to make their remarks. I would like to just make one house clarification. So everyone has this book, or if you don't, it's available up front. I'd just like you to note, these papers, while commissioned by KIEP, are still sort of in the draft form, and so you should refrain from citing them. You know, perfectly good to read through, but just please, if you could refrain for the moment until they're officially published, from doing any citations or anything of that nature. So please feel free to look at the material, but just if you could hold off on that for the moment. With that being said, I would like to introduce, just sort of going down the table, to my immediate left, we have Dr. Myung-koo Kang, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Baruch College at the City University of New York. He specialized in international relations and comparative political economy, primarily focusing on the financial crises and governmental macroeconomic policy responses, both in cross-national and the Asia-Pacific contexts. Next to him, we have Rorry Daniels, who is the Deputy Project Director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, based up in New York. In her role there, she organizes Track 1.5 and Track 2 conferences and meetings focused on security issues in Northeast Asia, oversees Asia-related publications and public events, and manages the project's grant and donation funding. Next to Rorry, we have Tom Byrne, who is currently the president of the Korea Society. Prior to joining the Korea Society, he was with Moody's Investor Services, where he was a senior vice president, Sovereign Risk Group Regional Manager for the Asia Pacific and the Middle East regions, based in Singapore. Next to Tom, we have his colleague, Jonathan Corrado, who is the Associate Policy Director at the Korea Society. He is also a contributor to NK Pro and a Pacific Forum CSIS Young Leader. We're also fortunate today, beyond our paper presenters, to have a really great list of discussants, the first of whom is Victor Cha, who is a senior advisor and Korea chair at CSIS, and as I'm sure you all know, I'd just like to say congratulations to Victor. His 10th anniversary is coming up here, and I guess less than a week now for the establishment of the Korea Chair at CSIS. And as you all know, prior to being at CSIS, Victor worked at the NSC. Next to Victor, we have Bill Newcomb. Bill is a fellow at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, and he's also the chair of the North Korea Economy Forum at the George Washington University, and formerly a visiting scholar at the U.S. Korea Institute at CSIS. And lastly, but clearly not least, we have Martz Fitzpatrick, who was previously the executive director of the Washington-based Institute of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and is also still a fellow there. He also headed up their non-proliferation and nuclear program, and prior to that, he worked on non-proliferation issues at the Department of State. With that, I will turn things over to Dr. Kang.
Great. Thank you for giving me a great opportunity to present my work. Today's presentation is about the idea that the North Korean regime would collapse soon. Why such kind of idea which I call the regime collapse thesis has originated here in the United States and South Korea. But in today's presentation, I'm going to focus on the origins of the idea that the North Korean regime would collapse in the early 1990s here in the United States. Before jumping onto the specifics, let me share the research background, why I came to be interested in this kind of topic. As you can see from this slide, this is the number of missile tests done by North Korean regime. But since the early 1990s, many pundits and scholars and so-called specialists of North Korea have repeatedly predicted that North Korean regime would collapse soon. Around 2012, one of my colleagues, I'm studying political science, and one of my colleagues asked me my opinion about the Kim Jong-un regime. So Kim Jong-un regime was established, and at that time they asked me what would be the future of Kim Jong-un regime, and at that time I was really confident that the regime would collapse soon. That was my basic perception. I had, frankly, absolutely no idea about the nature of North Korea, but I had such kind of strong perception that Kim Jong-un regime would collapse. And as we know, well, as of today, Kim Jong-un regime has not collapsed yet. It's, in a sense, still quite robust regime. So I started to think about, why we have failed in estimating the resilience of North Korean regime, and what is the fundamental factors and reasons we misunderstood the resilience of North Korean regime. And that's the theme I studied to interested in. And my argument so far, we can tackle this question in various aspects and looking at various factors. But in this project, what I have an interest in is the perception aspect, perception dimension. So perception seems to be quite important, especially in understanding our policy in dealing with North Korea. Because as you know well, our information, available information, particularly reliable information at the top leadership level in North Korea is quite limited. But still, we need to make judgments and we need to make policies. So that kind of situation is very, very challenging. And then this kind of really uncertain nature of condition makes the perception is really important in terms of interpreting the information coming from North Korea and how to make our own judgment in the end. So that's the overall theme I have been interested in. And regarding this perception issue, I guess many of you might be quite well aware of the condition. This public poll data highlight about 80% of American people, regardless of age, regardless of political orientation, they have really negative perspective and perception, opinions, unfavorable opinions toward North Korea. That's quite understandable, considering the human rights violation going on there, and the many factors is quite obvious. We don't think the North Korean regime, especially the Kim regime, quite in a negative way. And this kind of shared understanding and perception, the highlight essence seems to be the idea that the North Korean regime would collapse and we should make it collapse. that kind of idea, and I call it the collapse thesis in this project. Collapse thesis is composed of at least two major dimensions and aspects. It's not a coherent theory composed of really coherent axioms or hypotheses, and at the same time, the group of people who have suggested this collapse thesis is not a coherent group of people. So it's a little bit difficult to, we can observe huge variation within this idea, but I could identify at least two dimensions. One is economic crisis aspect, and the other one is power transition aspect. So let me introduce that aspect quite shortly. The economic collapse view, basic idea is that as we are fully aware of that, North Korean economic condition has been aggravating and aggravating. So bad economic condition will escalate into social and political crisis and ultimately systemic regime crisis. That's the idea. And in this perspective, pundits and scholars have highlighted a kind of dilemma the North Korean regime has faced. So to get out of this economic hardship or difficulty, North Korean regime needs to adopt a more aggressive, market-oriented reforms, but they perceive market-oriented reform as a kind of threat to the viability of the North Korean regime. So North Korean regime has been placed in this kind of dilemma situation, and probably the regime cannot take aggressive market-oriented reforms. That's the idea. Another thing is the succession crisis view. As you know well, hereditary succession is basically a counter-revolutionary idea. So when Kim Il-sung died in 1994, many pundits predicted that Kim Jong-il's leadership would not last long. And similar thing happened around 2011 and 12 when Kim Jong-un succeeded to his father Kim Jong-il. So basic idea is that hereditary succession is basically a counter-revolutionary idea. It's not even acceptable in the North Korean context. And then those people who highlight this succession crisis, repeatedly highlighted elite level splits or power struggle within the top leadership. But what kind of problems of this collapse thesis, the idea that North Korean regime would collapse, has? Let me move on to that. A couple of critics we can highlight, but one of the most important fundamental issue is so-called falsifiability issue. So if you think, a little bit more just for a moment, we cannot prove, we cannot disprove, or we cannot prove the validity of the thesis, collapse thesis, as long as North Korea survives. I think this is very, very important. So the thing is that some critics have tried to criticize this collapse idea that, look at the Kim Jong-un regime. It has not collapsed yet, so the collapse thesis is wrong. I think such kind of simple-minded critic is misleading, doesn't understand the real significance of the collapse thesis here in the United States in the policymaking community. The point is that as long as North Korean regime holds out, the collapse thesis can claim its validity. I think that is very, very important. But on the other hand, because of this nature, the collapse thesis has not provided somewhat testable hypothesis, empirically testable hypothesis. If you check out all those pundits and scholars who implicitly argue the collapse of the North Korean regime, they have not provided any specific empirically testable hypothesis either. So in a sense, North Korean studies has not moved on much. So I would say the collapse thesis is not just a research hypothesis, but it is also a kind of, it reflects the belief, shared in the policymaking community and shared moral and then normative judgment here in the United States. And another criticism is that the economic deterministic point of view. So the collapse of thesis repeatedly highlighted the bad economic conditions going on in North Korea. But historical studies, for instance, Dogville and then Martin Lipset, and all these existing studies highlighted while economy is growing, relative deprivation is more fundamental factor of social or political changes. But existing collapse thesis just highlighted the aggravating economic condition will lead into social and political crisis and ultimately systemic regime crisis. And that assumption seems to be reviewed more seriously again. Another critic is that those scholars who highlight a somewhat unique aspect of North Korean communism, they have criticized the existing collapse thesis as disregarding the unique features of North Korean communism. But I don't want to go into that aspect too deep. So let me move on to the specific research questions I wanted to handle in this project. The basic thing is that we need to ask, okay, if policymakers thought the North Korean regime would collapse soon, is it true? So we need to empirically find whether that is true or not. Second, if it is true, how can we trace the origins of that kind of understanding, shared understanding? So it's really a tricky question, how can we capture the historical formation of the collapse thesis? Because if you look at those literature and documents, nobody quite explicitly claims, except just a few, pundits, they usually don't explicitly claim the North Korean regime will collapse. They just imply, right? So it's really difficult to figure out the existence of perception. And so to tackle this task, I try to look at two sources. One is declassified government documents. Probably you guys definitely aware of the Mueller report, right? So redacted Mueller report. So according to the Freedom of Information Act, if we apply for the revealing of the information, the CIA and State Department and the government documents is all those classified documents are supposed to be revealed. But of course, those documents, declassified documents, are redacted. So still critical information is not available. So to supplement such kind of aspect, I had to conduct interviews, those actual policymakers who involved in the decision-making process. So I tried to combine both, declassified documents, reading all those documents is really fun, and then also try to contextualize those, declassified documents. And in terms of analytic framework, I tried to borrow so-called prospect theory. So if you're aware of the prospect theory, Tversky and Kahneman, psychologists, they wrote an article. This is the title: Judgment on the Uncertainty. So they tried to figure out how we make judgment, even though we don't know the clear outcome, we don't know the clear probability. But still, we make judgment. Policymakers actually face such kind of challenging, uncertain policymaking environment. And then regarding the North Korean case, one of the most critical constraints in understanding North Korea is the lack of reliable information due to inaccessibility issue. And then Tversky and Kahneman, they suggested we use our mental or judgmental shortcut in dealing with uncertain situation. And they suggested in most cases we use 3 heuristics. One is representativeness heuristic, an availability heuristic, an anchoring and adjustment heuristic. So I tried to apply this kind of conceptual framework in terms of understanding the origins of the collapse thesis. Let me move on to the specifics. So representative heuristic, in the early 1990s, one of the fundamental constraints in dealing with North Korea was lack of experts. The thing is that I'm going to talk about in a moment, but at that time, there was only one North Korea-related, officer. I mean, one officer was appointed in dealing with North Korea in the State Department. That was the situation. But so lack of export situation, but under such kind of situations, what event or country was the reference of the collapse thesis? And as we can imagine, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European communist countries and the German reunification issue. So these historical things worked as a kind of representative cases in understanding the future of North Korea. And that kind of idea created a kind of, reference-dependent bias. And second, availability heuristic. So lack of reliable information regarding North Korea was a fundamental constraint, as I repeatedly told you. So what instances did collapse it? Those people, highlighted the collapse of North Korea, recall in the early 1990s. And as we can, once again, the end of the Cold War, and another important context is that the end of history, so-called triumphalist ethos, shared in the victory of the liberal democracy and market economy since the late 1980s. It was quite real. And then another thing is that since the mid-1990s, during the Reagan administration, U.S. government started to develop the idea of rogue state. And in terms of dealing with the future security, global security and national security challenges, started to discuss the challenges coming from WMD-equipped authoritarian regimes in developing countries. Another thing is the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Basic idea is that once we make a judgment, we try to strengthen, we're trying to find information to confirm our initial judgment. And then this kind of pattern encouraged the U.S. government to implement the same successful foreign policy formula toward North Korea, which was successful in dealing with the Soviet Union and then other communist countries. So basically containment and deterrent policy in dealing with North Korea. And once initial prediction that the North Korean regime would collapse, that kind of idea was suggested in the early 1990s and mid-1990s, and once again mid-2000s, but the North Korean regime did not collapse. Under such kind of situations, those people who support the collapse thesis develop so-called auxiliary hypothesis to protect the core assumption of the collapse thesis. For example, North Korean regime could survive because of external help, from China or from South Korea. And once the Soviet Union collapsed, in terms of understanding North Korean regime, we have applied so-called puppet regime perspectives. So Soviet Union was the master country during the Cold War period. Once it was gone, and then China replaced the role of the Soviet Union. That kind of idea has been quite strong. So the thing is that try to protect the core idea that the North Korean regime would collapse by developing auxiliary hypothesis to protect the core assumption. Because when I submitted the proposal for this research, the KIEP asked me to include the origins of collapse thesis in South Korea, but in today's presentation, I'm going to skip that. Thanks. All right, let me move on to the U.S. origins. This is the real thing. So far, it's just a preliminary thing. So Reagan administration, during the Reagan administration, North Korea was designated one of countries of the Confederation of Terrorist States from the mid-1980s. And then after the Seoul Olympic Games, Reagan administration adopted the Moderate Engagement Initiative in 1988, and then built a so-called Beijing channel, political communication between the two countries. So the main idea is that Reagan administration was worried about the sudden collapse of the North Korean regime, disrupting the regional stability. And then the Bush administration, during the Bush administration, because of the Gulf War, North Korea was not a priority of the U.S. foreign policy. Instead, from the American government point of view, maintaining the existing global non-proliferation regime, particularly non-proliferation nuclear regime, was the priority. That was the priority, primary concern. So inducing North Korea to sign and implement the full scope of safeguard agreement with the IAEA was the main goal. Then under such kind of situation, Clinton administration was established, as you know well, and then agreed framework happened in 1994, and then CATO, Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, was established to implement the agreed framework. And then let me move on to that aspects in a quick way. This is the important part. Then, in terms of negotiating with North Korea to deal with the so-called first nuclear crisis, North Korean nuclear crisis, President Clinton, he was not much interested in international affairs. He delegated his decision-making power to expert. And in terms of appointing the negotiation team, the Clinton administration appointed so-called Soviet experts and non-proliferation experts. For example, Robert Carlucci, he was in charge of the negotiation with North Korea at that time. And Robert Carlucci, his official position was the Assistant Secretary of the State for the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. And he had no background of Korea. And most of the people involved in the agreed framework negotiation, their background is basically non-proliferation experts. So from the American government point of view, dealing with North Korean nuclear crisis in terms of maintaining global non-proliferation regime, that was the key. Meanwhile, those so-called East Asian experts, even Japan specialists or China specialists, they were not appointed. An interesting thing is that when I conducted an interview, one of them told me that in the U.S. policymaking community at the time, they intentionally tried not to recruit Asian experts because they are sympathetic to South Korea and North Korea. They might be sympathetic to Korean affairs. That was the thing. And then, as you know well, there was a crisis in the mid-1994, but in October 21st, 1994, agreed framework made. But agreed framework was a very bizarre kind of, compromise. And the North Korea just agreed to freeze existing nuclear program and going back to the NPT. But in return for that, U.S. government promised providing 500,000 tons of heavy fuel oil to North Korea and providing 2 light water nuclear reactors. And then it did not include special infections that could investigate the past nuclear activities of the North Korean regime. So it was just a freezing. We know that Hanoi deal failed, but it was just a freezing. But in return for that, Clinton administration promised all these compensations. But important thing is that from the beginning, Clinton administration was not quite serious about implementing those agreed framework. So at that time, Kim Il-sung administration opposed the agreed framework. But the important thing is that unofficially, I need further rigorous research about this aspect. But the negotiation team of the U.S. government at that time unofficially promised that the first nuclear light water reactor would be completed within 5 years or so. But as we know well, once CATO was established which existed until 2006, of course, nuclear reactors were not, established at all. So the CATO was established to supply North Korea 2 light water reactors and provide 500,000 metric tons of heavy fuel oil. But from the beginning, the CATO was suffering from lack of funding. So just for the annual delivery of 500,000 tons of fuel, it was estimated at least $65 million at that time. But U.S. Congress allowed only $20 to $30 million a year. So annual delivery was really irregular, never been satisfied, never met the deadline of October 21st of each year. And another thing is that light water reactor, funding was also delayed because Kim Il-sung administration did not commit for this funding for the light water reactor. Let me move on. And then, as we know well, in 1995 and 1997, North Korea suffered from famine. And then as the North Korean economy was going through real difficulties, the surge of defections happened, and Hwang Jang-yeop defected to South Korea in 1997. Under the circumstances, Clinton administration started to talk about the collapse of the regime, North Korean regime, publicly. So CIA Director John Deutsch, National Security Advisor, and CIA panel report in 1997 quite clearly made that the North Korean regime could not last more than 5 years. And under the circumstances, in preparing for the sudden collapse of North Korean regime, U.S. government started to develop so-called contingency plans, including military options. So various contingency plans in the Operation Plan 5026, 5027, 28, 29, and 30. And then there was a conflict during the Son Bush administration about this Operation Plan 5029 and Operation Plan 5030, because it assumed a rollbacking of North Korea. And then during the Kim Il-sung administration, South Korean government also developed this contingency plan, so-called Chungmu plans. So the basic point is that while the collapse thesis was prevailing, here in the United States, we have not developed comprehensive engagement plans with North Korea. Instead, we have developed post-collapse scenarios and plans. In the future, I need to conduct more research about the evolution in the 2000s, what happened under the Bush administration, what happened under the Obama administration. Also, the relationship between U.S. domestic politics and then U.S. policy toward North Korea, and the existing perception gaps in dealing with North Korea between South Korea and the United States. That's my future research orientation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'd like to thank KEI for hosting this conference, KIEP for supporting this research project, and the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, my organization, particularly my colleague, Juliette Lee, who couldn't be here today, for some critical logistical support for this project. I'm here to speak in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the NCAFP, about strategic mistrust toward the DPRK and the U.S. policy community. And my hope is that through this project, examining and discussing what we think the DPRK wants will make us better prepared to analyze the ups and downs of the diplomatic process and more open to opportunities for strategic change. So why trust? To me, trust is really the bridge that allows both sides to take the risks of compromise. So this is about credibility of commitments. And if we agree that denuclearization and normalization are part of a process and not an event, then we're going to need some trust to carry us through this process. Okay, great. But unfortunately, the relationship between the U.S. and the DPRK suffers from a history of strategic mistrust. And this lack of trust includes assumptions on both sides that our strategic interests do not align. So we have the history of failed agreements, which our former presenter very eloquently laid out, which become a part of our institutional and bureaucratic memory. And we have a lack of regularized contact because of the lack of formal relations, which doesn't allow us to have the kind of on-the-ground observational data and evidence that we might need to identify opportunities for strategic change. And then we also have concerns that I put in the basket of regime legitimacy concerns, which include contempt for each other's political systems, concern regarding each other's strategic alliances and partnerships, and anxiety about each other's role in the international system. And all of these concerns, which are really concerns about each other's strategic intent, reinforce gaps in our strategic interests. So the major question that I'm trying to get to in this presentation and project is, how do we get from zero trust to a sustainable agreement? And this is really the challenge of the diplomatic efforts that are underway right now. And to me, there are two essential elements to going through this process. One is that we need to observe changes in behavior on both sides. And two is that we need to have policy communities or policymakers on both sides that are receptive and open to these changes. So here's my very simplistic graphic representation of how a diplomatic process works, right? Like you have a basket of strategic interests from one side, a basket of strategic interests on the other side, and you use dialogue to kind of push them together so that you can find some areas of overlap. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that it matters what we think is in this pool of strategic interests of the DPRK. We'd like to test our assumptions about that pool through evidence. And we'd like to use dialogue to kind of bridge these gaps, right? But when we don't have dialogue, and as our previous presenter pointed out, we don't have evidence, what we have instead are our assumptions. And that's what this project is about. It's about unpacking our assumptions about what the DPRK wants. So, I see the U.S. policy process as consultative. As was previously pointed out, there were major problems between the executive branch and the legislative branch in implementing previous agreements. But for me, that's really, there are kind of four groups that feed into the policy process: the experts, executive branch, so elected and appointed officials, legislative branch, Congress, which controls spending and implementation of agreements, and then voters, which ultimately judge the progress and the utility of these agreements. And I chose to focus on experts because experts are typically people who interact with all of these different forms of the policy process. They're in and out of government. They're explaining policy to voters, and they're feeding recommendations into the government's policy process. So this project is heavily based on hypotheses on misperception by Robert Jervis, particularly 3 assumptions that I've outlined here. One is that people tend to fit evidence into existing assumptions or sets of assumptions, paradigms, and people also tend to see behavior as others as more coordinated, centralized, and disciplined than it really is. And this may explain why you can have one news story about what North Korea is doing and several different interpretations in the U.S. policy community about what its motivations are and what the goals of the action are. So, for example, when Kim Jong-un launched some short-range ballistic missiles after the failed Hanoi summit, you had some experts come out and say, that's it, diplomacy is over, it's a return to provocations, and we're headed back down the path of war. And some experts that say, no, he needs to placate people in his military, he needs to prove that he's still in charge. So really this is about what people think Kim Jong-un wants and what assumptions they're making about what's driving North Korean behavior. And then the third hypothesis that I thought was particularly relevant for this project is that people take credit when evidence fits their assumptions, and they lay blame on other actors when it does not. So really this is about whether or not you take evidence that's coming in and use it to change your assumptions, or you discard evidence that doesn't fit your assumptions. And Robert Jervis posits a safeguard to these hypotheses on misperception, and that's to just be as explicit as possible about your assumptions. So every once in a while, you need to pull that suitcase out of the closet, unpack all of your diplomatic baggage, see if the clothes still fit or not. And in doing so, you can determine whether or not your assumptions are still meeting the evidence in question. So the way that I went about examining assumptions is to ask 25 policy experts to sit for open-ended interviews from 30 to 60 minutes to have a conversation about what they thought the DPRK wanted out of this negotiating process. And there were 2 goals of those interviews. One goal was to unpack, examine, and to make as explicit as possible those assumptions. And then secondly, to develop a list of steps that the DPRK could take to evidence strategic change or to prove good, strong intentions in this negotiating process. And because I wanted these interviews to be non-predictive and as imaginative as possible, I asked the experts not to worry about whether or not these steps were likely or whether or not the steps would have significant impact. So I designed a survey after the fact to take all of the steps that the experts had identified and rank them in terms of probability and impact so that we could understand which policies or actions taken by the DPRK would be most relevant and most helpful right now. So I think everybody in this room and watching online probably remembers where we were in late 2017 when it seemed like we were on the brink of war on the Korean Peninsula. And I asked the experts to focus on the period from early 2018 through the Hanoi summit, which concluded right before these interviews take place, to ask them, how did we get from here to here, or here, or here, or here? Is North Korea on a charm offensive, or were they worried about what was going to happen and the threat of war on the Korean Peninsula? So I'm going to quickly summarize the interviews as best I can. But let me say that the through line, there were diversity of views on the question of what North Korea wants in this process, but the through line of all of the interviews is that the underlying assumption that most experts start with is that what Kim Jong-un wants most is survival of the regime. And everything else kind of flows from this assumption and what people think it will take for the regime to survive. So if you tend to think that there needs to be significant change in order to keep the regime alive, you have one set of assumptions. If you tend to think that the regime can survive with very little change, you have different set of assumptions. And the assumptions on the no change side seem to see the DPRK's behavior as tactical. If you think there needs to be significant change for survival of the regime, you tend to see the behavior as strategic, or that transformative change is very much possible in this environment. And to just very, very quickly summarize the framing areas, what experts thought the DPRK needed to survive was generation of wealth and improvement of foreign relations. So if you see those areas as needing significant change, and you tend to see the DPRK's motivation as strategic, you think that they need significant economic development and improving relations with the global community so much that they are willing to give up their nuclear program. And the concern or fear that, particularly right after the Hanoi process ended, the fear of these experts was that the U.S. was forcing negotiations, or the negotiations that the U.S. wanted would force change too quickly for survival of the regime, and therefore would be rejected by the DPRK. If you kind of tended to think that the DPRK could survive just fine on patterns of behavior that it had previously, then you think that the move towards diplomacy is tactical to buy time to normalize the nuclear program. So you think the DPRK can survive by repeating patterns of basically extortionist behavior, which I've summarized as negotiate, profit, renege, repeat. So that in the absence of bad behavior, they can gain some concessions from the international community, and to normalize the nuclear program. So in lieu of giving up the nuclear program, the goal would be to make sure that people think that the program itself is benign. And the fear that people who fell onto this tactical group had was that this extortion can continue indefinitely, undermining global rules and norms, particularly the non-proliferation regime. So the underlying question to all of this is the nuclear program essential to survival? And it's not, there was no consensus on this issue. However, there was a pretty clear majority consensus on whether or not the DPRK has already made a strategic choice to give up their nuclear program. 14 experts said no, 6 said not yet, 2, the evidence is insufficient or the question is irrelevant, meaning that states don't make these types of decisions. The nuclear program is a means to the end, and it will explore in negotiations whether the price is worth it. And only 3 people said yes, or yes with caveats. The caveat in this case was yes by 2050 or 2060, so in a very long-term time frame. So there's clearly very low trust that the DPRK had entered the negotiation with the strategic choice already made to give up their nuclear program and to put it on the table. So why did they come to the table? There were lots of answers given, regime survival up at the top, also lifting of the sanctions, the need to generate wealth, confidence in their deterrence. But there was also, so there were kind of 2 big general groups. One is that there's a group of people that think that the DPRK came to the table out of fear that it could not develop its economy without getting sanctions lifted, and it needed a diplomatic process to do that. Or the fear that it was over-reliant on China for both diplomatic and economic support, and it needed to diversify its foreign relations in order to avoid erosion of autonomy. On the other hand, there's some people who thought that Kim Jong-un came to the table out of confidence, A, that his deterrent effect had been established and there would be no more talk of war on the Korean Peninsula, and B, in a favorable leadership configuration in the U.S. and the ROK, that both leaders were more open than previous leaders had been to pursuing strategic change. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not a transformative change is possible in the era of major power politics. Does it serve the interests of the U.S. and China better to have a divided peninsula that is permanently at conflict? There were concerns that a unified Korea, even in a managed integration pattern, might be more nationalist and therefore a bigger challenge to strategic interests, including trilateral alliance relations with Japan, but also an overall globalization regime. And then there was, the concern of how to move forward on simultaneous bilateral processes. So for a lot of U.S. experts, warming South-North relations was a prerequisite for the U.S. being involved in a diplomatic process. There are also a lot of concerns that the two processes were moving at different speeds and needed to be better coordinated. And the same with regard to China-DPRK relations. A lot of experts recognize that the DPRK needs to consult with China before it reaches out to the U.S. and the ROK, but there are a lot of concerns about China's role in this process. Would it be obstructionist, or would it be helpful? And not because of general U.S.-China tensions or political rivalry, but because we have very different strategic interests in resolving this problem. A lot of talk as well about whether or not Kim Jong-un is a transformative leader. And thank you. What are the domestic political dynamics in the DPRK? Let me just pull out a couple of interesting points about this. Some experts thought that Kim Jong-un's self-perception, at least, is transformative because of his time spent out of the country. Other experts felt that the stovepiping kind of inherent in a Leninist system and the way that political patronage needs to come together in order to keep Kim Jong-un in power would preclude any efforts toward denuclearization, that the nuclear program is such a strong element of the patronage system that it would be nearly impossible to resolve the competing bureaucracy's interest on this. And because I have limited time, I'll just say that the surveys came out with 19 total policy choices for North Korea. They're all listed in the paper, so I won't go through them, but just to say that, I don't think any of them would surprise the people in this room. A full declaration of the nuclear program, verification on the nuclear program, signing a peace treaty with South Korea, these would all be evidence of strategic change. Just want to highlight in this slide that I asked the experts to rank the probability of these steps coming to pass in the short, medium, and long term. And although people felt that the probability was relatively low throughout the entire process, it did rise over time, which suggests some degree of openness in the policy community towards strategic change in North Korea. Skip that. So I asked them to rank the steps in terms of impact on 3 measures. One, is Kim Jong-un a transformative leader that seeks to change governance patterns and state behavior of the past to reform international relationships? And in terms of being a transformative leader, what was at the top of the list for the U.S. experts were domestic political changes, closing labor camps, establishing rule of law, demobilizing the KPA, et cetera. The next set of steps were about denuclearization. The impact of peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, sort of typical conflict de-escalation, verification of a nuclear program, demobilization of the army, et cetera. And on U.S. policy goals, right at the top are the denuclearization steps that Kim Jong-un could take. I matrixed these to see if there were any steps that had higher probability and higher impact, so that they would be the low-hanging fruit that might be first to the negotiating table. Pretty interesting that across those 3 measures of impact, there came out very similar, shutting down known existing nuclear facilities, establishing formal relations with the U.S., and positively promoting the image of the U.S. and ROK in state media and the DPRK would all be high probability, high impact steps. The only interesting thing on this slide is that for U.S. policy goals, establishing formal diplomatic relations with the U.S. was ranked far below just getting working level discussions going, which suggests that the U.S. is willing to wait quite a while on normalizing relations, but still sees strategic change possible just by establishing working level discussions. And then quickly, the recommendations that came out of this paper. Number one, both sides need to abandon maximalist policies. So for the U.S., this is outlining where a step-by-step process fits into a larger agreement. For the DPRK, this is resolving some ambiguities about the size and the scale of the program. Two, both sides need to devolve some decision-making authority and remove ideologues from the process. I think this is fairly self-explanatory. Friendship between the leaders is stabilizing, but it's insufficient. Partially because the U.S. policy process is consultative, and partially because there's an asymmetry of negotiators when the DPRK can't bring technical experts to the table. And then third, the ROK should tread lightly in this process. The risk of taking credit for being a good mediator is that you also take the blame if someone reneges on the agreement. And for what it's worth, I think that South Korea has done a very good job of treading lightly in this process and being a fairly good mediator without understanding the challenges of strategic mistrust that exists between the U.S. and the DPRK. So with that, I'd like to conclude by just reiterating again that what we need to break this impasse is to see changes in behavior, including the ones that were outlined in this research project, and to have a policy community that's receptive to those changes. And I hope in some small way that, unpacking these assumptions, laying them out, providing a list of steps can move us toward that goal. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. And like Rorry and Professor Kang, I'd like to thank KIEP for sponsoring this research project and KEI for hosting us here today. You've already met part of our research team at the Korea Society in New York. We're introduced to Jonathan Corrado, who's done a really good job. We had two more researchers help us out. One is here, sitting in the front row, Sally Son. She's from Columbia University, where she's also a hardworking intern, by the way. She's at Columbia University and is pursuing or just finished a graduate degree in quantitative methods and social sciences. And we had one more research assistant intern. However, she's back in Korea. The Sun-Young Chang, who was a graduate student in the course I teach at Columbia, and called Sovereign Risk at SIPA. And she works for Kocher, but so she had to go back and work in Korea, so she couldn't join us today. The inspiration of this project really began in 2018 when with two big events. One, Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech, where he said, New Year's Day speech, where he said he would start to shift the policy focus of North Korea to economic development. And then the second was at least the diplomatic opening of North Korea with the Pyeongchang Olympics, the so-called Peace Olympics, and also the summit processes that ostensibly were working towards a denuclearization that would be verified. So we were thinking, well, if North Korea will take the big step for to allow verification of its nuclear weapons program, why not go all the way and allow verification and monitoring of its economic program? And that would mean opening up to the IMF. So the big question was, for us, was opening up to the IMF. Okay, so let me see if I hit the arrow, forward arrow. Oh, that one. Okay, good. So This is an overview of the structure of the report. Section 1 offers an overview of North Korea's economic landscape. We were asked to do this by Kiev. I know others have done this pretty extensively. I guess our angle was looking at aspects of the economy that would suggest that North Korea is developing markets and also private wealth that could eventually build up some savings in the system to help finance North Korea's development in the future. In looking at this and also other sections, one of our conclusions is that North Korea's unwillingness to reform systematically, despite this marketization going on, is a more fundamental constraint than sanctions, because even if sanctions were to be removed, you still have this problem of can North Korea respond to more favorable external conditions. The second is that North Korea is stuck in a low-income trap from which it will not be able to climb out of, I think, without structural policy changes. I think most, at least since I've been at the Korea Society the past 3 years, whenever North Korea is discussed, it's discussed in the context of a security or political or diplomatic problem, but it's really, I think there's another economic problem going on here. In economics, we often talk about the middle income trap, but there's something called a low income trap, and North Korea is mired in this low income trap. The second section discusses North Korea's external debt and payments record, since we're talking about creditworthiness. And what we discovered is that North Korea has a long-standing track record of default. We all had heard about the bank defaults in the late 1970s and 1980s to foreign creditor banks, Europe and Japan. And then in the research, we uncovered defaults to governments, bilateral debt, mostly by extended by export credit agencies. But even in the early 1970s, before North Korea went out to borrow from the West, if you look at diplomatic cables, particularly from Central European countries that were part of the Soviet Union, they note that the Soviet Union was having a very hard time to get North Korea to live up to its share of the barter trade. North Korea wasn't formally a member of Comecon, or the CMEA, the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, but it took place in those barter trade arrangements, and it seemed like it was always lagging in providing materials to Siberia, to Russia, in exchange for Russian fuel oil. So that's something that we uncovered. We also made some estimates of North Korea's external debt, some wild estimates, but the best we could do. And 3 highlights North Korea's considerable infrastructure and development financing needs. Now, of course, our interest in this was picked because under the government of Moon Jae-in, he's offered these inter-Korean cooperation projects, mainly rail and road. And while we think those would be good for North Korea, infrastructure alone won't allow North Korea to develop. It really needs infrastructure. But moreover, looking at some research done in 2014 by the Financial Supervisory Commission in Korea, it was a non-official report from an official government agency, and you can't find it on its website. So it took, I think Sally finally found it. We were looking for a long time for this thing. So the conclusion I'll show you in one of the charts is that official lending from either Korea or say the policy banks in Korea, or if North Korea could gain access to international financial institution financing, meaning perhaps the IMF, the World Bank, the ADB, maybe even the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that would not be enough. North Korea would have to go out to the capital market to finance its infrastructure and development needs. And also, that would probably not be enough either, because no one's going to lend unless North Korea itself puts some skin in the game, and they would have to develop enough private savings and a domestic credit market, if not capital market, to take up some of the burden in infrastructure financing. And then Section 4 observes that every transitional economy has early on gone to the IMF. And the IMF and the IFIs are the World Bank, I just said, International Financial Institutions, et cetera, provide neutral technical assistance, and they help catalyze private investment. And in a sense, what they do is give a seal of approval for private creditors to go into a country. And then Section 5, what I looked at was there's only 2 countries that have not gone to the IMF. One is North Korea, and the other is Cuba. And Cuba actually has a credit rating. So I was trying to compare North Korea with Cuba, although that's a very difficult task. I think Victor Cha, I think I've heard it from you, Victor Cha, that you've described North Korea or the Korean problem as a problem of what do you call lousy outcomes, lousy options, a land of lousy options. Is that how you say it? Well, North Korea is beyond a land of lousy data. It's really, there's no data on North Korea. There's no national source data, which is really, so they're unique. Even Cuba has national source data, some that you can generate some sort of rough credit assessment. The idea of creditworthiness really comes from, we have a quote here. The creditworthiness is the ability of, in this case, a sovereign, a government, to borrow and the expectation that the government will repay. And so therefore creditors will extend loans to the borrower. But having worked at Moody's and I believe also at Harvard Business School, there's this wonderful plaque that dates from the 19th century, and it's on the cover of our report. But Daniel Webster wrote in 1834, and these words are at the bottom of this plaque, that commercial credit is a creation of modern times and belongs in its highest perfection only to the most enlightened and best governed nations. Credit is the vital heir of the system of modern commerce. It has done more, 1,000 times more, to enrich nations than all the mines of the world. So North Korea should focus on establishing creditworthiness and then maybe get the most out of its anthracite mines and whatever else it has. So basically the steps that have to be taken for North Korea to establish creditworthiness are, in rough order, restructure its external debt, normalize relations with its official and private creditors, engage the IMF, join the World Bank and regional development banks, seek technical assistance once upon engaging the IMF and World Bank for capacity building. And the capacity building also means improving transparency. One of the final steps to boosting access to credit would be to obtain an international credit rating. And then you go into a positive feedback loop where you further strengthen your economic institutions to improve your credit rating and therefore improve access to foreign capital. I'll go over three slides. The first slide you're probably very, very familiar with. This is really a slide of North Korea's choices, where in the 1970s, remember when North Korea was going out and borrowing from the Western banks and governments, its per capita income, as best as that can be measured, was about equal to South Korea. That's the blue and the light, the heavy blue, the dark blue and the light blue line converged at that point. And then it started to split when North Korea failed to take the next steps in reform and opening, and South Korea indeed did under President Park Chung-hee. And you get this wide gap in income. So this huge income gap between North Korea and South Korea, and we all know this. This corresponds very nicely with that night satellite image contrasting dark North Korea with light South Korea. The right-hand panel shows North Korea's boom-bust economy. So even though North Korea has embarked upon to some degree, ad hoc marketization, a hodgepodge of marketization measures really, it really hasn't been able to generate sustained growth. The years where you've had positive growth are really the benefit, in large part, I think, because of the cooperation with South Korea under the Sunshine Policy. So Sunshine was really good for North Korea, but that didn't lead to much, despite its growing trade relationships with China and later on, and the ability to export to China. This slide may not be as well known as the income gap between North Korea and South Korea, but what you see here is that going back to what we have, actually, we're looking at the reform period in Vietnam, which is 1986. It dates from 1986, where Vietnam adopted its Doi Moi, which I think literally means to start anew, or an opening program. And so we compared Doi Moi versus Juche Byung-jin. And again, you see this wide increasing gap. And this really reflects Vietnam's, one, willingness to go to the IMF, and two, seek international technical assistance from the IMF and the World Bank and the ADB, and also join the region. It was a very active member in ASEAN. And you see this huge gap between income in Vietnam and North Korea. This slide, the next slide, is actually what we, to my surprise, I never thought about this, what we uncovered. And I think this slide best demonstrates that North Korea is indeed trapped in a low-income trap. So North Korea is that red line, and it shows the per capita income. The source for the World Bank data, which is the green line, the HIPC countries, I'll mention that in a minute. The HIPC data come from the World Bank on the average per capita income of the 39 countries that are a member of the HIPC initiative. And the red line comes from the United Nations. So there's no national source data provided by North Korea, but the United Nations and others. There are other China customs statistics. They do have data on North Korea. So at least it might not be very robust, but it gives you at least a handle to start an analysis. And what this shows is that indeed, like one of the steps that's necessary to achieve creditworthiness or to achieve a growth in per capita income is to go to the IMF, seek assistance from the World Bank and regional development banks, and restructure your debt. Now, the HIPC initiative I talk about in the paper briefly is 39 countries, mostly in Africa. Afghanistan is the only one in Asia, and there are a small number in Latin America, South America. And these countries, once they are eligible to borrow from the World Bank's soft loan window, ODA, the Official Development Assistance, they can get debt relief and technical assistance. And when the debt relief started to reach a critical mass is when that green line started to take off. So this is the initial, this is one of the benefits of reform, going to the IMF, opening up. And again, the key steps are go to the IMF and restructure your debt. Normalize your relations with your creditors. And you can see this fairly big pickup in income. And so the gap is now reversed, whereas in the past, North Korea had a higher per capita income as best as that can be measured. Now North Korea is lagging even under the Kim Jong-un era. And this gap between the poorest countries in the world and North Korea is widening. This shows you actually I think the steps in establishing creditworthiness. And so I looked at China, Vietnam, the Russia Federation, and I threw in Mongolia there because it's the second country to become a communist country. It's never part of the Soviet Union, though. And it's also a resource-rich country like North Korea might be. We really don't know for sure. But North Korea does export a lot of resources. And you can see when the year of reform or transition, political transition started, shortly after that, all these countries joined the IMF. Later on, as reform and the benefits of opening were actualized, they became more interested in trade, and so they entered the WTO. But all of them, as soon as the reform process started, they sought access to the IMF. In the case of Russia, I think it's extremely interesting because Russia, part of the Soviet Union, in the closing months of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev actually signaled to George H.W. Bush that he was interested in joining the IMF. And in the final months of the Soviet Union, they received special association status that allowed them to receive technical assistance but not financing. It wasn't until the communist system collapsed at the end of 1991, I get that year right, when Yeltsin took over, that they entered the IMF, right, in 1992. But that took political will, and that political will on Gorbachev, I don't see that yet in terms of Kim Jong-un, despite some feelings, even among South Korean government officials, that North Korea is willing to go to the IMF. So they go to the IMF, they start getting technical assistance, the institutions start to improve. They're getting concessional financing, but they find out that's not enough for their development needs and their infrastructure needs, so they get an international credit rating agency, and that opens access to the credit capital and credit markets much wider. Shortly after getting access to or soon after getting access to having an international credit rating, having access to the international market, they start to issue international government debt securities, and that's the final column there. This table is from the Financial Supervisory Commission, and it shows over a 10-year period and then the 20-year period. How do I back up? Okay, where these infrastructure needs are, and so they're in the rail and railroad. The rail, actually, North Korea I think has more rail lines than South Korea, but they're very antiquated, and they can't carry heavy traffic. This is the sources of financing. This comes from the unofficial publication of an official Korean government agency, the Financial Supervisory Commission, and it shows that the policy banks, mainly KEXIM and KDB, will not be enough to finance North Korea, nor will ODA, which includes IMF, World Bank. And so North Korea, to finance its development needs, will have to go out to look for private investment, either from South Korea or from the global markets, and that's hence the importance of achieving creditworthiness. This is looking at internally. We started to delve in this whole area, this interesting area of marketization, and then the donju, right? The money masters, not masters of the universe, I think, but almost. Maybe they'll get that way. What this shows is that so this is the dependence on unofficial earnings. So market income now has eclipsed your earnings from a government salary, I guess. And these are surveys done with defectors who made it to South Korea. So the red line is unofficial monthly income, and then the official monthly income. Unofficial monthly income is income derived through the marketization process by the so-called entrepreneurs. So that has eclipsed the official income. And this is under the years of the Kim Jong-un government. Again, these are surveys. We don't know how robust they are, but we have them in here anyway. I think I have two more slides. I have about 2 minutes left. This shows the need for institutional improvement in North Korea and the importance of governance. So I picked the same countries I looked at for the transition, the steps that need to be taken to establish creditworthiness: China, Cuba, Vietnam, South Korea, and Singapore are the benchmarks. Singapore, the gold standard on governance. And you can see North Korea lags even Cuba in terms of rule of law, and then at the bottom, control of corruption. If you look closely at this, actually under the years of Kim Jong-un, North Korea has moved backwards in terms of governance. Governance has weakened. And I think the reason for that is this process of marketization. It's become very widespread, but since there's no rule of law, no contracts that are enforceable, no creditor rights, no investment rights, no private property officially allowed, it's a very inefficient process, and it's a process that really only works through corruption, and probably corruption, I think, has increased. That would be my hypothesis under Kim Jong-un from a low level. So that's a real big impediment for developing economic efficiencies in South Korea. The last slide I have here shows you Cuba actually has a credit rating by Moody's, a published credit rating. It's CAA2. That's all the way at the bottom of the scale. In other words, it's a highly risky, highly speculative investment. Good chance that over a 4 to 5 year period you lose money, and a significant amount of money. Well, actually not that much because it's a CAA, but you lose money. Big risk. If it was CA or C, particularly C means you're probably going to be wiped out. Vietnam is not investment grade, but it's a decent level non-investment grade rating. Many corporations actually issue debt at BA3 in the U.S. And you just casually looking here, you can see this is really One big problem is the lack of transparency in North Korea, which are the final two columns. North Korea today is based on BOK data, and North Korea 20 years is based on IMF data. Now, interestingly, back in 1997 in September, the IMF conducted a fact-finding mission to North Korea, and where they actually were provided some information, some fiscal information. So you can see that under fiscal strength, the third category, there's 4 broad categories to assessing credit quality. North Korea actually published revenue, expenditure numbers, and a budget balance. North Korea is actually fairly disciplined when it comes to government finances. It had small deficit that year. In previous years, it had a small surplus. But that was back in the 1997 fact-finding mission is the only document that I could find that had national source data from North Korea that's useful for creditworthiness analysis or credit quality analysis. North Korea today is from Bank of Korea data. No data on government finances, no data on external debt. And so the conclusion here is that North Korea really has a long way to go to establishing creditworthiness. But again, the first step is to go to the IMF, restructure its debt. But to do that, it needs a political commitment to do that, as the Soviet Union demonstrated with Gorbachev. Thank you.
Thank you. And then, Jonathan, did you have any comments you were going to make real quick?
No, if there are questions that emerge on subsequent information, happy to chime in, but I think that was pretty comprehensive.
Okay, thanks. All right. In addition to Kiev commissioning these papers, we also had experts review them. And so we have our reviewers here, and I'd like to start with Victor, please.
Thanks, Troy. And so thanks to Kathy and the Korea Economic Institute, Kiev, for putting together this event. I enjoyed very much the papers and the presentations. It's good to see also the support of younger scholars, and I include Tom Byrne in that category, doing new and interesting research. I was asked to comment on Myung-koo's paper, and so I'll make a few comments. But before I do, I'll preface this by saying that I completely agree with him that the collapsists were wrong, and I put myself in that school. I agree that the resilience of the regime was not expected, and that and I agree that there is a collapsist school, whether it's in the policy community or the so-called swamp here in D.C. or the blob. And also in elements of the government. Where I will raise some questions is on the degree to which the existence of a collapsist school actually impacts policy. And then also question whether the collapsist school really represents a normative bias in U.S. policymaking. Because I have questions on both of those accounts. The first thing I'll say is that we should give the collapsists credit. At least they have the guts to go out and make a prediction about something that will happen, even though it hasn't happened yet. I have many friends at Georgetown who are Middle East experts that predicted the Arab Spring after it happened. And I have many friends who are Russia experts that predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union after it happened. So in that sense, collapsists are willing to go down that predictive road, as opposed to most others, both policy experts and academics who prefer much more to be post hoc, to say, yes, that was obvious, right, after it happened. So one small point in this regard, and I know we did an exchange on this in the initial comments, is that I think it is difficult to locate a collapsist school. I mean, there's some very prominent, outspoken folks on this. It's even harder to locate the resilience school of thought when it comes to North Korea. I think there are many people, and you've cited some of them in the paper, who have argued for the resiliency of the regime, you know, in 8 years after the death of Kim Il-sung, there were people who argued for the resilience of the regime or tried to explain the resilience of the regime. But to actually find people in July of 1994 or in December of 2012, that said, no, this regime is going to survive, it's very hard to locate that people. One of the people that I think actually has been consistent on this and has been willing to be predictive is not cited in the paper, and that is my colleague at USC, Dave Kang. Dave Kang has been pretty outspoken on this, and willing to be on record. Okay, the first set of comments is on the question of falsifiability and evidence. The paper makes an argument about how the collapsus thesis is not falsifiable and therefore still remains powerful. And while I certainly understand the logic in that statement, I think you can make a general statement that the general opaqueness of the North Korean regime really renders all propositions about its future unfalsifiable. So you could certainly argue that the collapsus school is a hypothesis that can't be falsified. You could also argue that the resilience school is a hypothesis that cannot be falsified. Yes, the regime continues to exist today, and that might be evidence to that effect. But, I mean, frankly, in this room, and I won't tell anybody, if North Korea were to collapse tomorrow, how many of you would really be surprised, right? On the other hand, if North Korea were around 50 years from now, how many of you would really be surprised, right? That is the range of probability of outcome when it comes to North Korea, deriving from the fundamental opaqueness of the regime. So I think we can certainly say that the collapsus school is not falsifiable, but you can make the same argument about almost any prediction about North Korea's future, basically due to the lack of evidence. In terms of the statement related to this first point about belief, that the collapsus school is not based on evidence, but based on belief in the U.S. policy community without evidence. I mean, I can certainly understand why some may think that way because collapse hasn't happened. But if the origins of the collapsus school are, as Myung-koo says, in the early 1990s, there was a lot of early to mid 1990s. You cannot blame collapsus scholars for seeing evidence that there was a likelihood of collapse. What's that evidence? Well, there was structural evidence, right? The collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the unification of Germany. And there was evidence in the regime also, meaning the economic situation. So it was, the predictions may have been wrong, but to say that they were not based on any evidence, I think is unfair. I mean, again, they're wrong, but there was sufficient evidence out there for people to make that prediction that was both based on things happening inside of North Korea, but also based on what was happening in the world at the time. One could argue that the resilience school, and again, to the extent that there was a resilience school in July of 1994 or in December of 2012, one could argue that the resilience school was a school that was based on belief rather than evidence, because at that time there was really no evidence out there that would lead you to say, oh yeah, this regime would continue, right? I mean, like there wasn't another regime out there that you could really point, maybe Cuba, right? But there wasn't really, you couldn't point to Romania, right? You couldn't point to the Soviet Union that this was, so that you could argue the resilience school was based on belief more than evidence, while the collapsus school was based on evidence, even though they were wrong, right? The second set of points relates to collapse, the link between the collapse, you call it the collapse school. For some reason, I call it the collapsist school, and policy, right? And the assumption behind the work is that the collapse school is not based on evidence, it's based on belief and normative judgment, which then leads to the wrong policy or the bad policy, right? And one of the things that the paper points to is the domination by the intelligence community, sort of the the purveyors of the collapse school were largely a lot of people from the intelligence community and from the military, and that then led to policy choices that presumed that North Korea would collapse. And so I have a couple of comments here. The first is so I'm not going to challenge whether the intel and military community is more bought into the collapse thesis than other elements of the U.S. government. But I will say that I don't think the intel and the military community make U.S. policy. And they certainly don't make U.S. policy in negotiations with North Korea because, right, the output of all this is things like the agreed framework, the six-party talks, negotiations, or the absence of such agreements. The intel and the military community, the intel community provides information, right? They don't make the policy, right? They don't produce the policies. And the military community, in the context of this, really executes, right? They, again, don't make the policy. And then pointing to operational planning, right? When you point to scenarios and operational planning as evidence of a collapsed school because they deal with a collapse, is that for me? Because they deal with a collapse scenario, I think that's not the correct leap, logical leap to make. I mean, scenario planning does not connote a desired policy outcome, right? Scenario planning is just scenario planning. You have to plan for all different scenarios without necessarily connoting that one is the desired outcome. So I have 2 minutes left. Let me pick and choose here. Okay. So, the other point is the lack of Koreanists. The lack of Koreanists that the paper talks about. So, and particularly talking about the agreed framework. So there are a couple of things here. The first is to point to the lack of Koreanists is to say that all Koreanists hold the same view about North Korea's future, right? Because there is sort of a view painted in the paper that the intel and the military community, because they are non-Koreanists, all believe in collapse. What is not stated, but what is implied, is that if you had Koreanists at the table, then they would not necessarily buy into the collapse thesis, and that would lead to a different policy. Okay, so I'm a Koreanist, and I believe in the collapse thesis, and I think there are other Koreanists who also believe in the collapse thesis. So the absence of Korea experts at the negotiating table during the agreed framework, to me, does not connote that there was the predominant view that North Korea would collapse. In addition, if you look at the actual agreement itself, the agreed framework itself, that doesn't look like an agreement to me made by a government that thinks North Korea is going to collapse. Now, of course, the strong piece of evidence is the John Deutsch statement. That's one piece of evidence. But that agreement didn't look like to me like the United States was expecting North Korea to collapse. I mean, there was a multilateral organization that was created for the provision of light water reactors. There was a lot of money that was put into that, and maybe it wasn't all on time, but there was still a lot of money put into that. That looked like an agreement that was going to go on for a long time, not for a short period of time. Finally, one could argue that those who believe in the resiliency thesis don't exclusively pursue engagement as the policy option, and those who believe in the collapses thesis don't necessarily pursue sanctions. I think a very good example today of someone who believes in the resiliency of the regime and calls for sanctions is President Donald Trump, right? And he, in fact, thinks that the longer you put on the sanctions, the more pressure it's going to put on the regime so that they can come back to the table. Similarly, collapsists, and Myung-koo mentions prospect theory in his paper. One thing I would point you to is a piece that I wrote in International Security like a long time ago. But it used prospect theory on North Korea and essentially argued that even if you believe that the regime is in the domain of losses, right, that it is on the verge of collapse or whatever you might want to think, that actually argues for a policy of engagement, not a policy of sanctions, in order to prevent really risk-acceptant behavior by the target state in the domain of losses. So there's not necessarily a direct relationship between those who believe in resilience pursuing engagement and those who believe in collapse pursuing sanctions. And okay, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Bill? Sorry, yeah, you all are in reverse order on the table. Yeah, Mark.
Ready. Good. So as I said in my evaluation, Rorry Daniels is a well-conceived, well-executed, and well-described project. The questions she posed are insightful and the answers instructive. Now, normally in a review, if you say something like that, the next word is but. But. There's no but in my assessment. And her PowerPoint presentation was fantastic. I know about PowerPoint presentations because I give them a lot. I have a side job giving lectures on cruise ships, and you have to make it appealing to your audience or you'll lose them. But one of the companies I do it for, Viking, they don't like me to use political cartoons. And I don't know why, because political cartoons, they're so good at really driving home the point. So I thought Rorry used them to great advantage. By the way, I'm glad that I moved halfway through Dr. Kang's presentation. So people were looking at me, and I wondered, why are they looking at me so intently? Yeah, they weren't looking at me, were they? So I'm glad I sat down. So distrust, that's a fundamental thesis of the project. And as a former diplomat, I have a slightly different view on this. To me, I think distrust is a normal and actually necessary perspective for policymakers dealing with adversaries. President Reagan used to like to quote the Russian proverb, trust but verify. It's actually, it should be distrust but verify. That's what the Iran nuclear deal was all about. You distrust them, so you have lots of verification mechanisms. But I think it's very important, as Rorry was telling us, to examine one's assumptions about distrust and to do it in a rigorous way, the way that she did, the reasons for them, and then how distrust can be overcome. She commented early on in her paper that distrust toward the DPRK seems to be hardening over time as diplomatic overtures fail. I'm just curious about what the evidence is for that. I guess over the long period of time, the various overtures of the last couple of decades. But over the past year, I'm not sure that it's really evident. There's as Jervis noted, as she quoted, people tend to fit the evidence into their existing assumptions. So if you think North Korea is not going to denuclearize, you wouldn't change your view. But the one person who I think has changed is the most important person. Donald Trump, after the Hanoi summit, told Sean Hannity that he knows that North Korea is not ready to totally denuclearize. He still behaves as though they would, but he did say that. Now, I wasn't one of the 25 specialists that Rorry interviewed for this project, and no, I don't feel left out. Not much.
That's good. It wouldn't really be appropriate to have you review it.
Well,
then.
that's what I thought. It makes me more neutral as a reviewer. But I'm not neutral on the subject. In addition to being a collapsist, I'm among those who view the DPRK as a permanent bad actor. I like to think that I do so rationally based on the very nature of the dynastic regime, the corruption, the failed ideology, plus its history of internal oppression and external aggression. But I winced when Rorry noted that among the reasons for strategic mistrust is contempt for each other's political systems. Guilty. I'm also among those who think that North Korea has not made a decision to denuclearize. I'm ready to be persuaded otherwise, so I agree with the respondent who said that the answer to the question can only be revealed through completing the process of negotiations. I think that's a key takeaway. And it was very interesting to me to see the various steps that experts posited as would prove its willingness to make strategic changes. Although there was kind of a tautology here. You know, the most important steps that could have an impact improving North Korea's willingness to denuclearize were to actually take steps to denuclearize, like declaring and allowing verification and so forth. One of the other steps, it was kind of interesting. I thought the easiest step that North Korea could take, which in her hierarchy seemed to have a moderate impact, would be ongoing engagement at the working level. It seems to me that North Korea should be able to do that without any loss of face or without any disruption to their system. And why they don't do it is beyond me. I came up with several indicators. I was thinking through what other things North Korea could do to demonstrate a change of its system. I mean, they could make declarations about what's at Yongbyon, what it would mean to close it down. They could sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. They could accept visits by Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty organization officials. They could accept visits by the UN Human Rights Commission. They could attend regular meetings of the South-North that have been institutionalized but not regularized. They could make use of those communication channels. And then the final one I came up with last night as I was reading an article by advocating that the United States return the ship, North Korea's coal ship. Maybe North Korea could return the Pueblo to the United States. That would be a good step. I won't go on too long because we've got to get to audience participation, but I just want to comment positively on the way that Rorry went about these interviews, the two-step process. First you have brainstorming to come up with ideas that North Korea could do without assigning likelihood or impact, and then in the second stage to make those assessments. I thought she had a very good discussion of regime survival and how experts described two absolutely contrasting scenarios under which the DPRK would give up its nuclear program. One is that if it's totally vulnerable, if it has to choose between keeping the nuclear arsenal or keeping its regime alive. And then the opposite of if it's got absolute trust in some other kind of regime security mechanism, that it doesn't need nuclear weapons to preserve the regime. And I thought that these two contrasting scenarios guide the contrasting policy prescriptions that we all come up with of either maximum pressure or maximum incentives. Finally, just a word about the three recommendations that Rorry pointed to at the end. I think she's really sound on two of them. I do have a but. Okay, so one that both sides should abandon maximalist policies and delve into the details, and this means a step-by-step process at the working level. The United States is certainly, I think, willing to do the working level, not yet the step-by-step process. And that both sides, number two, need to devolve some decision-making authority. But her third recommendation, this is the but, was that the ROK should tread lightly in this process because playing the role of mediator may damage trust if one side reneges on previous commitments. The way I see it, ROK role is not just to be a mediator. Its involvement is much more important than mediation. Its involvement is existential because they're the ones on the peninsula. They're going to be there when the United States leaves or isn't involved. And I think that American assessments about these issues too often tend to deprioritize ROK perspectives. So I think it'd be very interesting if there was some kind of a similar project done in South Korea about the strategic mistrust toward North Korea in the ROK policy community.
Thank you, Mark. And now, Bill, if you'll take us home.
Thank you, and thank KIEP and KEI for inviting me to participate today. I've really enjoyed listening to the papers, and I particularly enjoyed the one I was invited to discuss. I would like to point one thing out. Tom showed a chart of the boom-bust economy of North Korea, and it's on page 6 of the report. And if you look at the year 1999, all of a sudden, North Korea pulls up from years of declining GDP to record a 6.2% growth that year. This is the manipulation of statistics, even though there's a paucity of them, for political ends. Because the Bank of Korea that year did not measure GDP, it measured gross national income. So they were counting all the foreign aid that was coming in order to get a positive result because of the politics at the time. So I think anytime you're looking at the available statistics on North Korea, whether it's foreign trade, whether it's misidentification among partner countries as to who's trading what, or to the statistics submitted to the UN, you need to handle them with a degree of care and caution about how they were collected and look at the methodologies that were used to put them together. I have other problems with Bank of Korea statistics, but this isn't the place for them. Now, as we meet here, the Financial Action Task Force is holding a plenary meeting in Orlando, Florida. The U.S. is the president this year, and so it hosts this the president always hosts the annual meeting. And I'm going to make a bet, it's a pretty safe bet, that when it reports out on Friday, North Korea will again, and as it has been every year since 2010, and most recently in February of 2019, it will be listed by name on the public statement as a money laundering, terrorist, and proliferation financing threat, requiring members and urging all other countries to adopt preventive countermeasures. And it's quite possible, judging by the press, that Iran will rejoin it on this public statement list, but that is still under debate because Iran hasn't implemented some steps it had agreed to take with the FATF. Now, what does this listing do? Well, it benchmarks how distant is the goal of obtaining membership in the IFEs, access to developmental credits on easy terms, and establishing even a high-risk commercial credit rating, which Tom was describing at the end of his presentation, and all of which would be essential should the DPRK choose to pursue a new course focused on developing its economy. At present, however, Kim Jong-un's latest economic policy guidance echoes those of his grandfather, especially directions given in the mid-1970s when he called for self-reliant development based on a policy of import substitution. This approach back then resonated among countries struggling to develop and was similar to policies promoted by Raul Prebisch and adopted throughout much of Latin America. The result for those countries that followed this path is kind of be called the lost decade. For North Korea, which never really pulled off self-reliance in practice, but never also established endurable links to the international community and its institutions, the poverty of its policies has meant it has not lost one, but many decades of development. Now, the challenge for the DPRK is to openly confront its past policy errors to take a new path. China did so. And in my view, such a sober assessment was one of the key factors that helped those who were pro-market overcome resistance of those who were pro-plan. Now, when reviewing too briefly the course of China's progress, the telescoping of history tends to make developments seem inevitable, as if we're all on rails from past to present. But if you take a step back and recall the strong opposition to market domination by Chen Yun and the notion of the bird in the cage, you see the kind of task that those who are trying to push China in the direction of markets had to overcome. Now, in addition to joining the World Bank, and by the way, China assumed Taiwan's membership in the World Bank and IMF in 1980 in sort of a very greased entry. But the World Bank initially did a survey of the state of China's economy. It went province by province, it went sector by sector. It was very, very thorough, and the World Bank was given phenomenal access to data, to interviews, and so on. But in addition to that, the Chinese did their own review. And the economist Xu Chao published the findings that were both shocking and condemning. Beyond the horrors of the Great Leap Forward and the chaos unleashed by the Cultural Revolution, there was another crushing element. From the mid-1960s, China had followed an industrial military investment policy called the Third Line, Much of the investment in industry was directed to reestablishing it from the coast to the inland, especially to scatter factories in remote valleys and hide them underground. As well known, planned economies grow extensively, not intensively, and the results on output were so catastrophic that the return on investment was more often zero or even negative. So the quest to gain efficiency and productivity eventually helped China's markets win out over planning by the mid-1980s. But North Korea is no longer centrally planned. And while markets have become a crucial element for consumption and encroach upon portions of the administered economy, there remains too little discussed and analyzed the second economy where planning remains dominant. So the question is, North Korea really able to offer the IMF and IBRD the degree of statistical and institutional transparency required for membership? Can it reveal how much is actually devoted to its military? And what about the off-budget expenditures that are used to support the palace economy? Can it confront its past to secure its future? I'm fairly certain that there will be voices raised to call for North Korea to be given a break, ease the terms of admission, and let exposure to international institutions over time do the hard work of changing the rigid systems that choke off economic development. North Korean exceptionalism is an old story. Just look how host nations have ignored its flagrant violations of the Vienna Conventions. It's a case of moral hazard. North Korea is saved from confronting the consequences of its actions and thus is encouraged in its risk-taking because others bear the cost. Most recent case in point is the ROK decision to provide 50,000 tons of rice. Do North Korea the greater favor of holding it to the same standards as applied to other applicants. By all means, help it weather the storms and setbacks of reform. I suspect that the J curve would hit with a vengeance once the second economy is called upon to free up resources. The paper on the road to creditworthiness provides an exceptionally useful comparison with the experience of others that have made the transition and Cuba that remains on the fringe. It is a superbly insightful paper, and I commend it to your reading as well as to Pyongyang's. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left. What I'd like to do is sort of gather questions, and then I will let our authors, and if you have a question for the discussants, answer, but I want to try and get as many questions as we can going forward. So if you'll please wait for the mic, we'll start with Gil.
I'm Gil Roseman, the Asan Forum. I want to ask about the collapsus theory, because it seems it's not put in the broadest perspective that U.S. politics has had collapsus theory since the 1950s. It's a lazy approach to how to deal with your enemy without considering what is the nature of compromise that you might have to make. It's still very strong today, but it comes from largely from the right wing, although there are other collapsus approaches. It's been very prevalent. It was very big in the 1990s, and I think it should be called what it is. It is a right-wing approach, hostile to experts and hostile to figuring out ways to manage problems without just blaming the people in your country who might want to make some kind of compromise or might have to deal with reality.
Okay, the young woman up here.
Hi, thank you. My name's Hannah Cole. I'm an incoming Boren Fellow to South Korea for the next school year. My question regards the future relationship or future negotiations with North Korea, and particularly for Rorry. Did you find with the experts that you interviewed, there was a particular inclination of whose responsibility it was to engage and whose responsibility it was to sustain? Because that is obviously going to be a conflict as we develop these receptive policymakers. Thank you.
Here in the front, Michael.
Michael Macetic, you've alluded to the fact or stated the fact that there's a paucity of information about North Korea, and you've made a very worthy effort, but I think you realize your book isn't going to become a bestseller. Some of the work that has been done by journalists, Don Oberdorfer in the past, and now most recently Anna Fifield, What kind of influence do these books have on the policy community, either inside government or the experts outside government?
Do you still, yeah, Ramon in the back,
Thank you, Ramon Pacheco from Brussels and from London. A question for the second speaker and the final speaker. The second one, Rorry, when you meet when we meet North Koreans in Europe, they always ask, well, the U.S. doesn't trust us. So what can we do for the U.S. to trust us on the short term, not on the long term? So what would be your advice? What should North Korea do over the next 6 months, 12 months for North Korea to gain some trust on, for the U.S. to have some more trust on North Korea? And on the final paper, one issue that has been discussed, as you know, in China, but also in South Korea, is the possibility of using Chinese development banks or even the AIV as a source of funding for North Korea. Can you comment on this? Do you think this is actually feasible to do even without the IMF seal of approval, as you mentioned it, or do you think that this is not going to happen? Thank you.
All right, and then Bill, right here.
Yeah, you know, I've always sort of thought that if people had predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, we would have been so terrified, we would have moved heaven and earth to prevent it from collapsing. Which is kind of the way I think about North Korea. Maybe not for the U.S., but for South Korea. South Korea is terrified of a North Korean, quote, collapse. One thing, Kang, I really like your presentation and Victor's comments on it. I'd suggest, if you haven't, go back and look at a national intelligence estimate produced in 1962. It's on the website, declassified obviously now. It's really interesting to read because if you change north to south, everything makes sense. The IC was predicting in 1962 basically that South Korea was on the verge of collapse and that North Korea was going to take over due to North Korea's much stronger economy and much better economic system, much better political system. It keeps talking about the junta in South Korea, talking about Park Chung-hee. My point in here, though, is that for both of those, policy reacts to information. This is, I think, what Victor is saying. So if you read a paper, South Korea is going to collapse, oh my gosh, you intervene to try to help it. And the Kennedy administration did. They radically changed our approach to South Korea, and the Koreans adjusted as well. And so, of course, collapse never happened. So I'm wondering how, in your analysis, you can sort of predict how a prediction that was wrong actually transformed policy to make the bad thing not happen. Not that I'm saying a collapse of North Korea would be a bad thing.
All right, what I'd like to do now we have those questions, and I also want to give you each a moment, if we only have a very little time to respond, if there's anything you want to respond to. We'll start with Dr. Kang and move down, and maybe each take about 2 minutes. And
2 minutes, okay.
Yeah, it's just since we're basically at noon now, so.
All right, thank you. Great comments. Thank you for Victor. Great inspirational comments. And then questions from the floor as well. The first, I would like to highlight, I want to respond to your question last, questioner's question. Unintended contribution of collapse, idea is that, in fact, from the Reagan administration and the Rotel government and Kim Il-sung government, they were really worried about the collapse of North Korean regime. So that's the underlying, motivation developing all those contingency plans. So I'm not criticizing or blaming the development of the contingency plans and all such kind of thing. So ironically, this collapse of thesis, contribute for preparing different way of engagement with North Korea. So at the end of Reagan administration initiate moderate initiative, some bilateral talk, direct talk with North Korea, because they were worrying about certain collapse of North Korean regime. Similar thing happened during the Rotel government. Rotel government tried to engage with North Korea under the pressure and the guidance of the U.S. government at that time, because they were worrying about certain collapse of North Korea. And in that sense, that's the, Going back to Victor's comment, what is the impact of a collapse thesis? And it's the same thing, but my point I try to highlight is that we have not much, spend our time and energy to develop our ideas, how to engage, how to induce the structural transformation of North Korea. So this collapse thesis, whether it's intended or unintended, developed a kind of situation that North Korea is not that important factor. We don't have to care how to engage with North Korea. I think that's the unintended policy effect of the collapse thesis. And even these days, if we ask quite in a straightforward way, what kind of comprehensive, for instance, medium-term, 5 or 10-year engagement plans with a specific implementation or commitment from the U.S. government, I don't know whether anybody can respond to that question in a straightforward and confident way. In that sense, the collapse thesis create a kind of environment that ad hoc plans in dealing with North Korea, not consistent and then comprehensive, plans in dealing with North Korea. That is one consequence. About the role of the dominance of intelligence and then security-related Pentagon dominance, I don't want to dispute, Victor's comment. He was at the National Security Council, as you guys know well. So I've never involved in decision-making process at all. But the thing is that the intelligence community, their role is always assuming the worst-case scenario. Of course, they need to develop many different kind of scenarios, but to a great extent, the lack of North Korea or Korea expert create a kind of environment that those intelligence community or intelligence agencies could dominate, not necessarily passively providing the information to those policymakers. They, in a sense, set the agenda, preparing for the worst case scenario of North Korea. I think that's a kind of policy effect of the collapse thesis. And then lastly, it's really difficult to identify the existence of perception, different perception. For instance, Victor's perception about the existence of collapses to school and my perception is different. So if that's how can we identify the existence of some different kind of perception? My strategy is that perception is in most cases taken for granted reality. So looking at the critical momentum, we are not fully aware of our perception, right? So our practical consciousness is not fully articulated and expressed through articulated, words. So how to capture this practical consciousness, the North Korean regime might collapse, shared among policymakers here in the United States. My strategy is looking at the critical momentum. So for instance, the sudden change happened after the death of Kim Il-sung and the succession process. So probably in the near future, some kind of massive political changes happens in North Korea or here in the United States. Once again, that kind of critical moment and then this kind of shared perception will play a role.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks to Mark for his very kind comments, particularly on the PowerPoint. I feel like my undergraduate degree in screenwriting is finally paying off. So please feel free to write a note to my parents about that, who financed that incredibly expensive and useless degree. And thank you. And if you ever need a substitute on the cruise ship gig, just let me know. That sounds fabulous. You mentioned how can we tell that distrust is hardening over time as overtures fail? And I like to point back to comments that experts make about buying the same horse twice or 3 times or 4 times, that there's just sense that distrust is kind of path dependent and that building trust after an institutional memory of a failed agreement is much, much harder than it looks. Are we buying the same horse twice, or were there failures on both sides that caused the horse to not be the same color as we thought it was in the first place, or something like that? And as you say, distrust is a normal and necessary perspective. So it's natural for us to put distrust first and to have a much harder time thinking of scenarios and finding evidence to trust each other. I take your point on the ROK role, that it's more important than being a mediator. I think that is definitely true. And if anybody is interested in funding further studies to look at the South Korean perspective on North Korea's strategic intentions, my information is widely available on the internet. Who has the responsibility to engage and sustain engagement? It's a very interesting question. I do go into a little bit of detail in it in the paper. Those experts that tend to emphasize North Korea's developmental state, that they are developing and poor country, tended to put more of the onus on the United States and other major powers to engage and to sustain engagement. One expert who's in this room right now also talked a little bit about China's role to engage and sustain, and how do we make China a stakeholder in this process instead of a free rider on the process. And I think that that is an area worthy of further writing and discussion. I'm not sure that this question was directly addressed to me, but the influence of journalists and journalistic data on the policy community. I think this is a really, really important perspective, but would only add that journalists are people too, and that they come to their stories with a certain amount of assumptions, biases, et cetera. Of course, there are journalistic standards in place that try to present information in as neutral a way as possible. And I haven't read Anna Fifield's book, which looks fantastic. But I think that I would put journalists in the pool of experts that people look at when they come to make assumptions about North Korea and North Korea policy. I would also put foreign diplomats working inside North Korea in that pool as well. I just have less access to those people, and so they weren't included as part of the study. What can North Korea do in the short term, 6 months or so, to regain some trust? I think the obvious step is to regularize working level discussions, and particularly important for the expert community, perhaps also self-serving, is to bring technical experts into the process so that there's parity on the teams. There's a sense that even U.S. negotiators, working level negotiators, aren't on a level playing field with their North Korean counterparts, because the U.S. side has the ability to work within a wider framework to, adjust things and meet in the middle, whereas the North Korean side does not. So giving some evidence or having some experience of the North Korean negotiating team, their availability to use discussion to move closer together would be very, very helpful. Again, this is a little bit self-serving, but if they were interested in doing such a thing, I would suggest that they go back to track 2 discussions, which we organize. So I would bring those two things to them in the very, very short term. And then in the medium to longer term, I think making internal reforms would be so important. So important to have evidence in the United States that North Korea is pursuing a path of transformative change. So some of the things that my colleagues on this panel have identified would also be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom, Jonathan?
Follow up. Bill, thanks for your compliment. I remember years ago at Columbia, then we were talking about, it must have been the early years of the Sunshine Policy. There were a lot of optimists that North Korea would turn around and actually adopt reform. And maybe you don't remember this, Bill, but I do. Bill put the whole thing into process. The North Koreans would really like to go back to the state system, but they just can't do that. That was their real aspiration. I think your comment about the Financial Action Task Force was very appropriate. We get to that in the paper. So for North Korea to, say, gain access to the IMF, of course it would have to be a verification and denuclearization. And more broadly, there'd have to be normalization of relations with the United States in particular. This would be important also for ADB financing. ADB doesn't have an explicit IMF requirement, but when North Korea did approach the ADB years ago, the U.S. and Japan, the 2 largest shareholders, blocked North Korea's approach, even though the South Korean government was, I think, supportive of it. So the point is that there has to be a normalization of relations with the U.S. There has to be an unbundling of layers of sanctions, not just the anti-nuclear weapons sanctions, but also the anti-money laundering sanctions against money laundering done by North Korea. Gorbachev attained this special association status. The political opening that was the normalization was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that allowed George H.W. Bush to in fact, endorse this special association with the IMF. In fact, the IMF, the first time they heard about this was in a speech that George Bush made. You're right about this telescoping of history, because under Gorbachev, they were, I think, like 5 years of perestroika and glasnost, but it failed because of internal resistance. And Deng Xiaoping's, the reform process wasn't going too smoothly in China in the first decade. After the first decade, a lot of resistance in Beijing. And Deng Xiaoping went, his famous Southern Tory, did this ad hoc without the approval of the party establishment. And that was the get rich is glorious in the beginning of the special economic zones in 1992 in China. So yeah, this issue of internal resistance has to be overcome. In regard to North Korea, I'll get my last comment will be on the AIIB. I think China could serve as an example, but not a model for North Korea. One reason it can't be a model, because this is an impossible book to write about North Korea. It's called Economic Policymaking in China: The Role of Economists, written by Peter Baudelaire, someone who lives in Washington, 1949 to 2016. So it looks at the older generation, the young generation, and the in-between generation of economists who were influential in Chinese, identifiable economists in Chinese economic policymaking, including those who salvaged China's economic plight after the disaster, the Great Leap Forward, Great Leap Forward, right? Yeah, in the late 1950s through 1961. So is, I think, no coherent economic policy making in North Korea, because there aren't any economists in North Korea. When the IMF did its fact-finding mission in September 1997, one of the comments was everyone firmly believed in Juche and the leadership of Kim. That would be Kim Jong-il at the time, I think, after Kim Il-sung died in 1994, right? So you have this basic problem in North Korea, where you don't have people who think beyond the party orthodoxy. In regard to the AIB, actually this project kicked off even before we knew about the project. When I went to the AIB, I had done the initial ratings for the AIB visits, and I met with senior management, and I asked the question in early 2018, well, can North Korea get access to infrastructure financing from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank? And the answer was no, because North Korea would have to join the IMF. So the AIB operates as the World Bank and ADB does. It borrows from the market to on-lend to its borrowing members, and it wants to borrow at the cheapest rate possible. It wants to protect its AAA rating. And by lending to a country that will probably immediately go into arrears and default, does not help the creditworthiness of the institution itself. So this is a big impediment for North Korea. In regard to the Chinese development banks, yeah, so I've asked the question, it wasn't part of this paper, why isn't North Korea part of the Belt Road Initiative? Because a lot of countries that are poor in Asia and elsewhere that are borrowing under the Belt and Road. But one reason I think is that a lot of the lending under the Belt and Road is actually commercial lending, and it's done by the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank, and they probably did their internal creditworthiness assessments and knowing that North Korea would not repay the loans. And so would the government come in and back them up. There could be geostrategic reasons. Is Beijing ready to help out North Korea that's nuclearized? The last point I'd like to make is that relates to like the policy banks and governments having the creditors to North Korea have to protect their own creditworthiness, let alone be concerned about North Korea's creditworthiness. When the German unification process was largely funded by the development bank KfW, only a little bit of the East German reconstruction funding came from the German government budget. Most of it came from the market, so KfW went out to the market and borrowed and then lent for projects. So KfW had to protect its own creditworthiness, and that would be a big concern for any development bank, whether they're Chinese or South Korean, lending for infrastructure development over the long run with North Korea.
So I'm very cognizant of the fact that I am the person and the thing between you and lunch, so I'm going to try to make this really brief. So I have just two brief comments, first related to Mr. Newcomb's point about North Korea's tendency to engage in financial crimes, and then Mr. Mosetti's point about the importance of investigative journalism. So first, with regards to financial crimes, North Korea has been designated a country of primary money laundering concern by the Treasury, Section 311 under the USA Patriot Act. That's a devil to untangle. It's a consultative process that will take a long time and will not be easy. There's both executive and legislative sanctions on North Korea related to its financial crimes. So very complicated and difficult to untangle. The North Korea Policy and Enforcement Act sets a high bar for the untangling of sanctions. Included is releasing political prisoners from its gulags. So it's a pretty extensive and difficult process. Human rights figures in both in this legislative capacity and also in terms of disinvestment campaigns. You could think of South Africa as an example for the importance of that. It's going to be difficult to encourage large-scale private investment unless there's an improvement on that front as well. This is a really great question about how journalists contribute. So given the paucity of information, it's absolutely essential that we turn to these types of resources. The fact that this information doesn't exist in the first place is itself a helpful indicator that shows us exactly where we are right now. North Korea does have a statistics bureau, but it's inefficient and there are internal inconsistencies, and the information is not widely shared even within North Korea's bureaucracies. In the 1997 fact-finding mission, they were planning to do a 2-week training session in China thereafter, in which North Korea's Ministry of Finance economists would have learned how to do Western-style economics and would have also digitized some of their files. That never happened. It just fell apart. That would have been, that's our loss. That's North Korea's loss, really. So given that, how did we, assemble this information? We turned to lots of different journalistic sources, and there's great investigative reporting out there right now that's helped us a lot. So just to name a couple, this is not comprehensive, that we used and cited in our report. Daily NK has market prices and economic trends. They've got inside sources in North Korea. They're funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. They do great work. A lot of their reporters are defectors themselves. We talked in Seoul with Chu Sung-ha, who's a defector reporter at the Donga Ilbo, and he just wrote a book called Pyongyang 자본주의 백안전서, which means the Pyongyang Capitalist Encyclopedia. And he described to us how there are ad hoc systems emerging for private ownership in North Korea for purchasing apartments. So stuff like that is really helpful and wouldn't exist if not for the work of enterprising investigative journalists. We also quote outlets like Wall Street Journal, VOA, RFA, Financial Times, lots of different places. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that organizations like KEI, CSIS, CFR, HRNK are also doing lots of great original research to procure the information and to fill in the gaps for information that we don't have. So, for example, we cited CSIS's report on the emerging market system, and they conducted a survey inside North Korea. So that's just one example of how we use other sources to fill in the gaps. But that's a great question. Thank you.
All right, and then I just want to give, if Victor, Bill, or Mark have any very quick last thoughts.
Thanks, John, for plugging our work. I forgot to mention, we actually have an event on Monday, the 10th anniversary, so you're all welcome to come. But let me just, so on the whole collapsus resiliency thing, Gil's question about statement about laziness. So, the collapsus resiliency discussion is basically code word for containment versus engagement, right? I mean, that's effectively what we seem to be talking about here. And I think we're beyond that now. I really do. I mean, I think if we call collapsists lazy, we can call resiliency school lazy too. I think we can call both schools dogmatic, right? Because neither of them seems to change their view regardless of whether an agreement fails or succeeds. I mean, the resiliency school still calls for engagement even though it means buying the horse for a fourth time, right? So, the notion that that we're in this world, I think we're beyond this. Second, on the notion that regionalists believe in resiliency, therefore they prefer compromise. is also, I think it is a term from the past. It is an assumption, a view from the past. I mean, just look, the Obama administration was filled with regionalists who were working in North Korea. Sung Kim, Joseph Yun, Yuri Kim, Laura Rosenberger, right? I mean, these were all Korea regionalists, and they pursued basically a strategy of 8 years of malign neglect of North Korea. So, I mean, I don't see how regionalists are more interested in engagement. Look at the Trump administration, for God's sake. No Korea experts, right? Zero Korea experts pursuing engagement, and incredibly lazy as they do it, right? I mean, so there is nothing that these dichotomies don't make sense anymore in the world of North Korea policy.
Well, again, recognizing that time is short, I'll just make a couple of comments. One, on intelligence pushing worst-case analysis, it doesn't. If you're doing scenarios, you do best case, worst case, and it's really hard to move the needle off muddling through. And you know, guys who read the assessments, I think, can verify that. In terms of engaging with track 1 and track 2, I'm all for it. I think we need as many of these kinds of meetings to build understanding as possible. I would just like to have one ground rule. I'd like to have North Korea pay for its own delegations. That way you know that they're there because they have sincere interest in it, not because it gives them a chance to go shopping in London. Thank you.
I'm not ready.
All right, so then on the no free shopping trips, I'd like to thank all of our paper writers who did a really great job, and all of our reviewers and discussants. If you join me in thanking them, and then lunch is just outside. Thank you.